Hi everybody, welcome back to Onegano's Let's Talk Water. This is your host, Makash Licking Horse, and this episode we're going to be talking about traditional ecological knowledge. And if you don't know what that is, stay tuned and find out. Ona!
And also, just another thing that I really would like to start with is sort of a visual image, like an aerial photo of the Amazon. This is a Matawai village in Suriname, in a part of the Amazon that's really sort of near and dear to my heart, where I've spent over 5 years working with the community to map their lands and record their oral histories. And this was a beautiful shot that was taken at around 6 in the morning, so you can still see a lot of morning fog over the trees. So again, starting with good vibes and a beautiful picture of the Amazon to really get us started in talking. But obviously, there's also a lot of tragedy, ongoing in the Amazon. And before we talk about, what's the subject matter of today, which is traditional ecological knowledge, I wanted to give you a bit of an update. So, as you know, last year there was a series of devastating fires that were raging across the Amazon that really got the world paying attention to how the biggest rainforest was being destroyed at a rapid scale. And like everyone at ACT, at the Amazon Conservation Team, we were really shocked when it started to happen. And everybody at ACT was working around the clock to get a grasp on what was happening, to make sure that our sort of friends and family and the partner communities in the Amazon were doing okay, and trying to get aid as it was needed as fast as possible. We were also flooded by outreach, by media requests, and also calls of solidarity from our allies, including, as I mentioned, from the elders in Six Nations. And we're super grateful for all the moral and spiritual support that we received. So eventually, when the fire started to subside, the truth started to come out on how the fires happened. And a lot of the research showed that most of the areas that were caught on fire were actually cut down beforehand. So there was deforestation that took place before there were fires. And some of those areas that were set on fire went out of control. And there were others that were affected by increased droughts. So climate change was a factor there, and they caught on fire eventually. So we really learned that what was going on what happened last year wasn't an anomaly, because there had already been this sort of increase of deforestation in the Amazon and cutting of trees. And so we really learned that it wasn't something new. It was just something that kind of was heightened because of the intensity of the deforestation and then also the climate change. So it's basically the same fight that we've always been fighting, right? Which is against people that are encroaching onto the forest, onto indigenous lands, that are causing deforestation and extracting from those lands. So it's the same fight that we all have been fighting. What happened this year, unfortunately, it's looking pretty bad as well. You see here a chart that shows 2019 and the previous years, where there was a real increase of deforestation. And then also now what's happening in 2020, showing that there's actually been kind of an increase in spite of or taking place because of the COVID-19 pandemic that I'll talk about a little bit later as well. So that's what's really worrying us right now, is that the data is showing an increase of deforestation. And so consequently, we could face an equally devastating fire season. So this is something that we're really monitoring very with our partners on the ground, because we want to ensure that the fire season this year is not going to be as severe as it was last year, and also working with the partner communities, the indigenous people in the Amazon, to make sure that they're prepared, that if it does happen again, that they have knowledge and awareness and know how to prevent it if it does approach onto their lands. Another thing that's kind of worrying is, so in Brazil, the government officially proclaimed a ban on fires for the summer in order to prevent the extremity that happened last year. But one thing that doesn't prevent from happening is kind of the illegal deforestation and a lot of the illegal felling of trees and fires that have been set. So even though the government is trying to bring it under control, it's still concerning to us. And so what we're doing now as ACT is we're trying to do what we can to respond to the fires. So initially, a lot of our response for the communities focused on relief and just getting humanitarian aid and helping communities rebuild and supporting indigenous peoples organizations that were working across the Amazon. But now we're also putting a big focus on future preparedness and resilience so that the communities are ready to face these kinds of crises when they happen again, if they happen again. Of course, the other sort of twin crisis that's happening right now has been the spread of coronavirus, of COVID-19, which is unfolding in real time across the Amazon. And so here we have a map that was produced yesterday by an organization called Rapam, which is showing the extent of the communities that have been affected by positive cases of COVID-19. You can see that it's really spread all across the Amazon at this point. Close to 45,000 indigenous people have been recorded positive for COVID-19, and close to 1,500 people have perished from it. It may not sound like a lot, but a lot of communities are very small, even with less than 100, the population less than 100, and even just a few deaths can be really devastating. So a number of our indigenous leaders have already lost their lives to COVID-19, including some of our friends and allies. So as you saw in the ceremony, in the dedication video this morning, when we started off, this is the Governor Jose de los Santos, who is a Kogi, who is a Kogi leader who dedicated his life to defending the rights of indigenous communities of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. And again, he's from the Kogi, who actually have a long-standing relationship with the Haudenosaunee going back over a decade. So this is somebody that was a leader for that community who really fought very hard for the land rights and sort of rights to ancestral territory and sacred sites, who very sadly lost his life to COVID-19. And then another powerful leader from the Jengu was Aritana Yalawapati, who ACT knows from years back when we helped his community map their lands, which is another sort of loss. But there's also hope. And this is really what I want to sort of emphasize. You know, this is a season that that is happening to the Amazon right now, and it's something that will pass. And there's also positives that we can emphasize. So I personally work with a community in South Suriname called the Trio, who have had a number of positive COVID-19 cases a few months ago. But the communities have pretty much, the people that were affected by it have pretty much all recovered because everybody has been taking a traditional medicine called wataki. And so far, everyone has recovered well. So now everybody in Suriname, all of the indigenous peoples are taking this medicine, which really shows you kind of the true value of traditional ecological knowledge and that ancestral knowledge that has value beyond just the knowledge of the landscape, but also healing and spiritual healing. So ACT as an organization, we're doing what we can to help with COVID-19. So we're, trying to offer humanitarian aid, translating materials to the indigenous languages about how to prevent COVID-19, about proper hygiene, about awareness of where it's currently located. And we're also supporting indigenous organizations and partnering with clinics. And so just like with the fires, the COVID-19 situation is teaching us that we need to help communities be prepared and resilient for future crises that could be on the horizon. It's also showing us that the work that we're doing and that Oneganos is doing as well to capture traditional knowledge is critical. So as we know, it's the elders that are the most affected by COVID-19, and there's a huge risk of the loss of ancestral knowledge, which could be traditional ecological knowledge, or it could be oral histories that teach the young people who they are as a people and how they are connected to their lands. And so it's really highlighting for us also the importance of doing the kind of work that we do as organizations around capturing, recording, and ensuring that the younger people have access to that ancestral knowledge, which is something that's going to give them that resilience that I mentioned. So this is something that ACT has been doing for a long time, actually, going back to some of the very first maps that ACT helped make with indigenous people, representing ancestral knowledge of their lands. So over 20 years ago, as an organization, the Amazon Conservation Team were working with indigenous people in the Amazon to make maps of their land in order to capture some of that traditional ecological knowledge that the communities had that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So some of that knowledge is place names of places that might have a spiritual or sacred significance. And I know that later on we're going to hear from Chief Arvol Looking Horse, who's going to be sharing some stories about his about sacred places in his landscape as well. And so it's the same thing in the Amazons. There's a ton of really important places for the communities that have this kind of cultural significance and really shows the community members who they are as a people and how they are connected to the landscape. So this is something that ACT has been working on for the past 20 years in guidance with Indigenous elders and under request from the community who, when they realize that some of the younger people aren't learning about the traditional ecological knowledge or the historical knowledge about their lands as much as they used to. So there was a need to start documenting some of that knowledge so that the younger generations have access. So this is one way of doing that, and that's mapping. And so that's taking a look at the landscape and sort of seeing where the places are and where the resources are, like where the medicinal plants are, places where people go hunting, and where they can find different resources for the community. More recently, something that we've been doing is recording the oral histories that the elders have. So we realized that just writing things down or mapping was not enough to capture the extent of that ancestral knowledge, especially as it pertains to oral histories about some of those spiritual places that I talked about a little bit earlier. So what we've been starting to do is recording the elders as they share the oral histories about the different places in the landscapes. So what we're doing as an organization in that process actually is working more with the younger people. So training young people how to use video recording equipment and mapping equipment, and they are then the ones who interview the elders and ensure that the stories are being transmitted. So in so doing, you're kind of creating the ability for the younger people to learn right as the recording is happening, which is very exciting. And in that way, it's something that the community themselves is doing. And then we as an organization are more like the tool to make that happen and to give the trainings for the younger people to take over that process. So we started to do this in the Jingu, actually, which is a place where both Makasa and her mother have been, as well as Chief Arvol Looking Horse, with a community called the Wauja. So we started to do that work with video recording and then also mapping. So what we've recently been doing over the past 3 years is developing an application called Terra Stories, which is essentially, it's an entirely free and open source application that's meant for mapping Indigenous oral histories. So it's something that can run without internet access as well. And it's something that allows communities both to document their knowledge and to share it, but then also to protect it, because there's a way to restrict some of the oral histories and place names, as I'll show a little bit later on. So we started to do this work with a number of different communities across the Amazon, including the Wauja. And the way that it works is essentially you have maps that are designed by the communities that has their knowledge and ancestral knowledge of the landscape that you have on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, you have different stories that are associated with places in the landscape. So it's a way to both enable communities to create custom maps of their land, as in the slide that I showed earlier, where you had the gentleman that was holding up the paper map, as well as connecting the oral histories that might be connected to some of those places in the landscape. So you can either explore the map and sort of zoom in and out and check out different places and then click on points to view stories about those places, or you can view the stories and then it travels and it sort of zooms in and takes you to the location on the map. And then from there, you can full screen the stories and kind of check it out. And this is all something that can work offline. And as I mentioned, another sort of nice aspect of it is that if you want to protect your knowledge, the software enables you to do that. What you can do is you can set stories as protected so that you can only view them once you've logged into the system. So let's say that there's an instance of this with this application called Terra Stories, and it's set up for an Indigenous community. There might be some stories that they want to share with a broader public or even within the community. And so when you open up the application, you see those stories, but then there's another set which is protected behind a login. So you can only view those once you've logged into the application with the credentials that only you have access to. So this is a way that we're using to restrict and protect some of that ancestral knowledge, which is not supposed to be shared with outsiders, and which is really just more for internal usage and the maintenance of the territory. Um, it's an application that's designed to be very fun and friendly to work with kids. So it works on mobile as well, and we've worked with a number of communities, focused especially on the young people that are, in grade school. The teachers really like it because it's a way for them to learn computer skills and literacy, as well as a little bit of history and language and geography as well. So it's a great way to teach young people about different things that are already in the primary school, like computer literacy, but then it's focused really on the ancestral knowledge, right? So it's combining that kind of learning together with more traditional education. So we recorded this in a methodology that we've been starting to share over the past couple of years. And so, as Makasha mentioned, I was lucky enough to meet her and her mom a few years ago when the Amazon Conservation Team traveled to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where we got to meet. There were a number of other Indigenous groups present as well. And we all got to sort of share about the different struggles in the different landscapes where we all work, and realizing that there was a lot of connections between, what's going on in Six Nations and what's going on in the Amazon, and how sometimes the struggles are kind of the same and the needs are very similar. So we started to share a little bit more actively since then, and I've been lucky to be kind of involved in some of that process together with Liliana Madrigal, who is the founder of the Amazon Conservation Team. And here's a picture of all of us that we took together at the UN Permanent Forum. Makasha, I think you're in there, as well as some other folks. And we started to talk a little bit more about Six Nations, right? And how we could do a similar kind of project, really looking at the ancestral knowledge of the Haudenosaunee traditional lands. So just like in the Amazon, the different Haudenosaunee communities also have their own kind of ancestral knowledge and traditional knowledge of the land. And this is a map that's kind of an example of that, where you have some place names of importance around the Grand River and other areas, which are place names that have stories attached to them, that have a historical significance, or even like a cosmological significance, or just historical places.
Maybe Kerdo can comment on a little bit, give us an example on how that would work in Six Nations. Maybe when he talks later on.
Yeah, he can give a lot of information. He likes to talk, that guy. But it's really a fascinating and amazing work that you're doing. I really like the aspect that you have geared towards children more, because it helps recognize the land more as a family member, rather than it just being something that you use. And and by something like you use, all the time, a lot of people see it as just something that's for them, and they usually abuse things like stuff like that. So I really like that aspect of it, and I find it really amazing. I find it fascinating. But we
definitely can like use it like in land claims.
Yeah.
And we can use this as a tool to reclaim our lands. And I think it's really important to give our land the names that we traditionally given them. Instead of saying Mackenzie Creek, it could be a name that we had already come up with. And instead of saying like the Grand River, it could be the name that we came up with. And I think it's really important to have access to knowledge, like how Brantford used to be there used to be a village there, or stuff like that. Like, I think it's really important to know where our land, what it's called to us. And that knowledge is not really like, and especially in Six Nations community, it's not really accessible. Like, we can't really access that knowledge, especially if you're an urban native living in Brantford or Hamilton and the surrounding cities. Like, there's no way that you can access that knowledge easily. Like, you can't really access an Elva or an Jock because they're so overworked already. Our traditional knowledge keepers are already so overworked. And if we had something like this, I think it's really important for people to have access to that kind of knowledge.
That was a lot of what we were, me and Gerda were doing at our work, and people were coming to us, but we were also going to the classes, but we only went to um, the schools that were locally, that were in our reservation area. Like we went to Gavanillo a couple times, and we went to um, IL Thomas and Emily C. General. And me and my brother, we always went there and we did social dances and stuff like that, and did protocol of dances and stuff like that. But I would like to do more of like more traditional knowledge with those kids, because they need to know it the most, because our people will suffer the most if they don't have it. And what else was I gonna say?
Well, I like the
I forgot about
aspect.
what I was gonna say.
I like the aspect that you have. I think it's important to emphasize, especially in my community, that there's ways that you can restrict knowledge, because there's a whole bunch of people who are always worried about oversharing knowledge, or not oversharing, but like, how do we protect our sacred knowledge, or our knowledge that is not supposed to be known to outsiders and things like that. And I think it's really important that you mentioned that it can be restricted to certain people, and but yeah, it is important.
I remember what I was going to say. The word Canada, it's actually a mispronounced Mohawk word, Ganada, which means village. So when people say, I'm from Canada, they're mispronouncing a word from our own people, which is pronounced Ganada, and that means a village. So everybody that lives in Canada is part of the village people, YMCA and stuff like that.
Yeah. So do you want to tell us about like what kind of work the Amazon
conservation team does
exactly, and like how it came to be?
Yeah, sure. No, and also even looking at this map, right, that's on the screen right now, you see that there's one name for Toronto, which I think was also sort of a native name, Ateronto.
Yeah, it's Tarondong, and it's a log in the water. And there's two stories, and we kind of figured out like practical use for those words as well. There's one story that there used to be a big giant tree that had fallen down, and all of the surrounding people knew about this tree, and they used it as a bridge, and that's where all these different people came together, and they would use this bridge, and it was like a big trading sort of like spot, and a lot of people would come through there. And the other the other reason is that they had these different types of fishing weirs inside the water, and they would line them up, and it was this giant one. And for the people at home that don't know what like a fishing weir is, it's basically a sort of like funneling system where they put sticks in the water, and the fish, depending on what size type of fish you want, you would make them smaller and smaller and smaller. And all you really do is go into these spots that are in the water, and they have different sizes for like minnows, bass, walleye, pike, and different other types like salmon, and a lot of different types of fish that would come in from the ocean, from the rivers, and they would come into these lakes utilizing the rivers and stuff like that. But that was one of the reasons why they had that name, which is just a log in the water, basically. And Gerdo has helped me with a lot of that research as well. Me and him sort of like spearheaded all of the information that would go out of Kayanase. We sort of bottlenecked it, like how you have restrictions on your information. We basically, like, we were the ones that were deciding what people needed to know, and what we could tell to every outsiders, and what we would say to our own people. And with our own people, we basically just had like all this information, and we would just like shove it right down their throat. And so like it was just like all this information, and basically the the more information you give them, they're basically gonna hear something and they're gonna latch onto something. So if they get one thing out of that, they can come back to us and we can elaborate more. But
did you want to tell us a little bit about how you know Chief Arvol Looking Horse?
Sure, yeah, no, and thank you so much, Dexter. That's so fascinating, and it's the kind of thing that probably most people don't know, right, about Toronto, even though it is an Indigenous name. And then, of course, you have some of the other names on the map that have only been given kind of settler names, and so those original names have been erased from the map, which is why it's so important, right, to produce maps like this and the ones that we've been producing in South America as well, that sort of retain that traditional knowledge. In South America, when you zoom in on where the Indigenous peoples are, you either see nothing, like on Google Maps, for example, or you see only colonial place names. And so a lot of knowledge has been taken off the map, which is why it's important for us to make our own maps, right? And to help the communities make their own maps.
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
We got started doing this as well and sort of exchanging with Six Nations and with other communities. And so, well, here's another example, right, of some maps of the kind of Haudenosaunee territory that we'll actually talk about a little bit later. So I think that's coming up, so we'll skip that a little bit. But so just to finish up that story of how we started to work together, right, is after the United Nations, when we all met, we decided that it would be nice for Amazon Conservation Team to come up to Six Nations and to sort of share some of our experiences. And in terms of the mapping and how we've been doing this work and how we start usually working with communities and what are the different steps involved in producing maps that go into an application like Terra Stories, which has both these kinds of place name maps as well as oral histories. And so a year and some months ago, we were able to go up there, and I met with the Conegio School, and we did a couple of trainings focused on that. And we did this really exciting workshop with the students there, where the kids who are also keepers of knowledge. I mean, that's why I think your story is so beautiful, Dexter, because although we tend to think of the elders, it's younger people that also have knowledge of the lands, right? Like you two do, and everyone does. And so everybody's involved in this sharing and this transmission from generation to generation. And so for us, it was really meaningful to also sit down with the kids at Six Nations, who then also drew out their knowledge of the lands and the Grand River and what is important to them and what kind of traditional ecological knowledge they have about the river, which you would be surprised. They are aware where there's plentiful fish, for example, because they go there with their parents to go fishing, right? So there's already that traditional knowledge that even younger people tend to have of their lands. So it's a collective process always. That's why we call it participatory mapping, and that's what ACT has always done for the past 20 years, is to work with communities to basically to show them how to use tools so that they can do the mapping themselves. So very recently, we were part of a hackathon that was organized by an organization called Geo-Indigenous Alliance, where it's basically Indigenous people worldwide that want to use maps for their land reclamation purposes. And so there was a hackathon challenge that was posed by a gentleman from the Lakota, the Sioux community from Rosebud Tribe, whose name is James Ratlingley Jr. And he wanted to see, very interestingly, as to like what I talked about earlier, how in North and South America the needs tend to be very similar. He wanted to see maps and an application that the younger Lakota people could utilize to hear stories in the Lakota language about their lands. And so I read that challenge and I said, oh, wow, that's Terra Stories. We're developing something very similar in South America. So I wanted to sort of share with him and the community to sort of show off what the application could do when it's utilized in the context of their ancestral landscape. So if we have time for it later, there's a video that I can show where basically we submitted a challenge where we didn't work with the community yet. I just created a demo of the application and sort of showed the Lakota lands and a few sample stories so that the community members can see what this application can do for them. But
we could put the link for the video.
Sorry, go ahead.
We can put the link for the video inside the description as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But what I did for today actually is I prepared Terra Stories with a little bit of stories from the Lakota. So yesterday we actually had the occasion to meet with Chief Arvol Looking Horse, where he shared us a few stories. And we also did some creative mapping yesterday where we put a few of the Haudenosaunee place names on the map. So just for to sort of wrap this part of the presentation up, and then I think we can have more of a conversation. I kind of wanted to show you how the application works. So as you can see here, you can translate the language. And so I only know a few words in Mohawk. And so one of those is to greet somebody, right? Which is correct my pronunciation if needed, Shekon.
Sego.
Sego.
Sego, yeah. And
Okay.
that's greetings, like how you doing, basically.
Yeah.
Mm.
And how you say thank you is Niawan, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Niawan.
Yeah. Throughout our Haudenosaunee people, there's basically like 5 different ways you can say it, but Yahweh is basically the universal term for thank you, and it means a lot of different things. Like instead of Sego, you can say Scano, and that means good, or everything is. It's a really big word. Like it has this like big meaning, and that's like basically what we can boil it down to is just the word good. Everything is all good. Sego, like when people meet each other, they say, "Oh, Scano," Yahweh Scano, and then when you put those two words together, like Yahweh and good, it means I'm thankful you are well.
Sego. I love it. Thank you for that.
No problem. Yeah.
Yeah, what you can do with the application is you can translate the whole thing into your own language, basically, where you put in your own, text, so that all parts of this application is translatable. And I think that's really one of the things that makes it really valuable for, especially for communities that are sort of revitalizing the language, where there's been a little bit of loss, and there's an effort being made to teach the younger people how to speak the language. So it can have that purpose as well. But also in the Amazon, you have communities that don't actually speak English or Spanish or Portuguese. They only speak their own language, right? And so that's why we made it so that you can translate it into any language. So what I did after our conversation yesterday, and after we sat down and spoke with Chief Arvol Looking Horse and heard some of the stories that he had to share, is I put together a basic map in for Terra Stories where what you see here is what I did. The first thing I did was I took off the sort of the settler name so that you don't see anything like Canadian or the United States borders. I made it so that it's just Turtle Island and just a few place names just as an indicator of where you are. And this is something that you can customize. You can add your own place names. Once you have that all mapped, it's very easy to put that into the Terra Stories application so that you represent the data how you want. You represent the maps how you want to, with the place names that are important for you. But for now, what I did was I basically just have an area that is representing the Sioux lands and then the Haudenosaunee lands, and this is data that I took from the website Native Land, which is also a Canadian-based project to sort of enable people to learn whose land you're on, especially for settlers that want to do land acknowledgements or want to learn about native lands generally. It's a website where you can kind of search your own address and figure out whose land you're occupying. And so this is data from that website. So you see here the extent of Sioux lands, of the Lakota, as well as of the Haudenosaunee there. And yesterday we did some recording with Chief Arvol, Looking Horse, who we'll hear from in a little bit, where he shared us a few stories about Chief Crazy Horse and a camp that he had, where which is very located very closely to Chief Arvol's house, and also of a Lakota sacred site. So what we did was we recorded Chief Arvol Looking Horse telling those stories, and then we recorded where those places are, those sacred sites, and then I put them on the map in Terra Stories, so that we can actually zoom in on those places and let me see and listen to the stories. So the way that the application works is you can also kind of filter through the different stories. So you see here at the top left, you can actually, for example, select a region. So on the map that I just showed you, you had both the Sioux region as well as the Haudenosaunee region. So what I did in the application here, and I'm showing screenshots, we can do a live demo at some point later. I filtered down to the region of the Sioux. And so then it zooms in on where those stories are located. So in this case, it's just showing the stories by Chief Arvol Looking Horse. And you can also filter by the speaker. So that's what you see there, that I filtered his stories so that you only see the stories of a certain person. So if you want to only listen to that person's stories, you can filter it in that way as well. And then this is really sort of the magic of the application, is that when you click on one of the points on the map, you can see, you can show a picture of that location, and then it really shows you the stories that are related to that place on the map. So this is a, as we learned yesterday, this is a Sioux place called Mato Tipila, which is in more like the European settlers, they gave it a different name, which I think is Devil's Mountain or something like that. And it's
Dad, did you want to talk about a little bit about the story of Mato Tipila?
Yeah, we can actually hear the story now. This Chief Arvol is with us today.
This is our sacred sites, and so we have many stories, but all the tribes across U.S. They recognize this place as a Mato Tipila, the Bear's Lodge. And there's a story that when you go to visit our sacred place, the Devil's Tower or Mato Tipila, they never really had that story till recently too, about Mato Tipila. So we never had in this country, they wiped out our, it's like a Holocaust or massacres that's going on that happened to all indigenous people, and many tribes were lost. They were wiped out. Anyway, today, we're still surviving as First Nations and always in the forefront of progress, in the name of progress. And use church and boarding school. I was in the last stage of the boarding school and on the reservation. These reservations were concentration camps back in the 1800s. See, a lot of changes happened last 100 years, over 100 years. And those of you that think over 100 years is not very far. This when our people were and I speak a lot about the environment, the way that we live in. A lot of our Monsanto today, and all of our rivers have been poisoned, and we're faced with the pipelines and fracking, and it's a very dangerous place to live in today. All the poisons that were that's in our food, and a lot of shots that was given to indigenous people, and we don't believe in that because we have our own medicine. So I grew up since I've been a leader for our people since the age of 12 years old. I became the bundle keeper, a nacha, a chief, and I speak fluent language, and I know all the ceremonies. So the state gave me an honorary doctorate degree because of the knowledge, the sacred knowledge. And today, a lot of elders that I grew up in that time, they're all gone. And today, we went to the United Nations in the early 90s, and I met a lot of old elders there. And most of them are all gone except Foreign Lions, and a few, Grace Smith, Hammer from Navajo Nation. So these are all these elders that went there talking about the environment, and that Mother Earth is sick and has a fever. And that was the same year that the scientists came out with a statement called global warming. But our way is unwritten, or it's oral history. We have a lot of history and a lot of our places of worship and the Manui Choni, the water of life. So we took a stand at Stand Rock, and that's what we shared with the people that know. Today, what is happening right now is not good. With what we hold in the ceremonies is with the water. Every ceremony, we have water. We have our spiritual medicine, but it's affecting our ceremonies. All this Western disease, which we call Wawazan Chunka, Makakan Chigihapi. They have a big sickness here that came upon us now. And this big sickness is affecting us as families. And in our way, when one person is sick, it affects the family and it affects the nation. And so we are trying to go against everything that's going on right now. And right now, they're taking a stand against the pipeline. And we set up borders here on the reservation to keep the people from bringing the COVID-19 in. It's a virus, a big sickness. But these are all in the prophecies that I grew up with knowing about our sacred bundle, our prophecy, and that someday the white animal shall be born. That will be at the crossroads, either be faced with a lot of chaos, disasters, tears from our relatives' eyes. We're going to see a lot of earthquakes, volcanoes erupting where it never erupted, happened before. We're going to see a lot of sickness, global disasters. No more on-the-board wars. We're going to see a lot of anger, a lot of hatred. Brothers and sisters will be fighting. We're going to see a lot of false prophets. We're going to see great changes and becomes the norm. People will be accepting these changes. So these are, all in our prophecies, because we see false prophets, false leaders, and that's happening now. And that's why, long time ago, a leader takes care of the family, takes care of the nation, and it's the wealth is with working with the medicine and the health of our people. That's our well-being, health and well-being. So,
Dad, you talked about leaders, and do you want to talk about how our lineage goes back and how Crazy Horse was hiding in the story that you told yesterday?
yes, Crazy Horse was Tashunko Bitko, Wichashaki Lila Wakanaha, Lila Washaka. He was a very powerful man and always in ceremonies. And he believed that to live freely, no treaties to be signed. And he shared a lot of people know of Crazy Horse. And what I spoke of yesterday was that Crazy Horse in his time back in the 1800s, he was all over our territory, and then tried to protect our territory. And up where the sacred pipe was brought to green grass our community back in the 1800s. And it was like a very huge camp. A lot of teepees all along the river. It's a beautiful river. And there's so many camps that was there. People camping, and they want to be around the sacred bundle, because this is a big city back then, thousands of teepees. And anyway, Crazy Horse, he would come to the sacred bundle. And one of the last times that he camped was 5 miles west of Greengrass, called Makasa Red Earth Creek. And so I grew up listening to the elders talk about this place where Crazy Horse camped, and him and his riders, his security, they came to the sacred bundle, and Crazy Horse filled his chanupa and he prayed there at the sacred bundle. And when I became 12 years old, these elders told me about the stories of Crazy Horse, and they said, we're living a very dangerous time. When I became the bundle keeper, you can't talk about the sacred pipe, or you can't talk about your grandfather. His name is Looking Horse. And the elders said, someday you're going to know about your great grandfather, Looking Horse, in time. But now you just stay with the sacred pipe, and you can't use foul language. You can't join the military or raise your hand under the United States flag. I never did. This is my life as a medicine spiritual leader, bundle keeper. I stayed with our the laws of the Chanupa, the sacred pipe. And so Crazy Horse, he came to Greengrass. Then he was camped west of Greengrass, 5 miles west, and then from there he left towards southwest, towards Black Hills. And he, when he was camped towards that way, he told the people, he said, "Let lila waham letranka hacha balahai law." He said, "Last night I have a big dream." It was very sad. I saw the future. When I saw the future of our people, it was very sad. It was really a dark time. And it was very sickly. The people were having a hard time. And then it said it even got worse, where how the disease has affected the people. And way at the end there, he said, I saw a tree. I saw that sacred tree. And all these people standing there in a circle. And all nations, all these people, all different nations are standing there together under the sacred tree. That's what I see. Then he said, as he told the story, the people saw that, and his tears came to his eyes when he spoke to the people. And they never seen that before. Anyway, after that, he turned himself in. And who rode with him all along was Looking Horse. Looking Horse was his bodyguard, or his right-hand man of Crazy Horse. And so now all these documentations and all the history that was told by the military and the written documents that were shown of Crazy Horse, Looking Horse was the right-hand man. And they taught that in Chicago right now, in the University of Florida. They're the ones that contact me and said, today we have all this evidence. Anyway, they rode together to Fort Robinson, and Fort Robinson, Crazy Horse, no, he was stabbed in the back by one of our own people. Jealousy. And then, Looking Horse was there. And anyway, that's our families that we couldn't even talk about Looking Horse, back in the early 1900s when I was a young man, as even my age at the time, they say, we have to post security to have ceremonies, and you can't talk about your grandfathers. You can't talk about the sacred bundle. And it was really hard. It was a very dark time for me. Mm-hmm. But today I get to share, because these are things that is unwritten, that our history. But now people are, we have different ways to understand all this history that came together, So I want to, share that with you today because, we are taking a stand today as we still are in the front lines of what's happening in the name of progress.
Yahweh Arvol.
Yeah, it's definitely a devastation with our devil. It's called Devil's Tower when it's a sacred site, and just like Mount Rushmore, that's a sacred site, and they put people who have done terrible things to the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations, and they're the ones who made residential schools. And he mentioned that he was the last person, and that's my father, who went to residential school. So it's not that long ago that residential schools have affected us. It's not my ancestors. No, it's my father that went there, and it's other people's who they're still walking around, and they still have. It's not real old. Residential schools aren't real old. Like the last one closed in 1996, and that's the year that you were born.
Yeah. A lot of the education that still goes on in the schools today, they call them public schools now, but a lot of that education is still in play. They don't teach us about our own people. They only have a little section about our people, and we're seen through a third person point of view. So we're seeing ourselves outside of ourselves. And that was talked a lot about in our own teachings back in at Longhouse. They say that there will be a time where you'll be on the outside looking in, and that's the point where you'll be fully assimilated into colonizers' way of life, basically, and you will have to relinquish all of your rights and all of your lands and all of that that we held in a high regard, and that was our wealth back then. And that's exactly what we're here today standing against. We're fighting against that. We're still alive, and we're still fighting against colonizers and assimilation and society. Modern society is what they call it today. And it's not really modern at all. It's the old way of doing things, old way of conquering and dividing us and making sure that we are susceptible to their own will, basically, that they can take our what we used to call sacred, what we still know is sacred to this day, because there's been a small group of people that held this knowledge, like Arvol himself, and my good friend Kerdo dear, who helped me with all of this research and actually helped me bring a lot of this information out of myself and into the public view and into our own community. So with that, I would like to introduce my Ongaitse, Kerdo, or Kahanta Kerdo, dear. and he is a ecologist at Guyana State, and he was also one of our cultural tourism guides, and he did a lot of medicine walk, tree identifications, and he helped me with a lot of explaining and sort of being able to convey my own thoughts and ways of thinking into the modern society. So, Gerdo, could you introduce yourself just a little bit more and a little bit of background in your work? Welcome to the show.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. And also good. Kind of get Gaso. Well, I guess everybody knows me as Gerdo, but that's the nickname from my full name, Gerdo Mohawk. And I just introduced myself in case, because I guess a lot of our families are bilingual or trilingual or whatever in Six Nations. Yeah, so I currently I'm on parental leave, looking after our baby. He just turned 7 months, and so I'm off for now, but I'll be returning in the fall time back to Kayanase. So currently, I technically work for the Oklahoma Skills and Trades Training Center. I am the cultural coordinator there, and it was just a shift in titles to something to do with funding. But I am still based at Guyana State here in Six Nations, and I still develop tours and some of the programming we do with different groups that come to the site. And you guys hear me?
But we can't really see you.
Oh,
Yeah. Get better connection.
I can try.
Just
give me 1 second.
Yeah. You can stand on a roof or something.
I was trying to sit outside because it's a nice evening, but
yeah,
that's around back to the Wi-Fi.
just hear the baby screaming in the back. Well, congratulations on your baby. Anyway, I didn't really get to fully congratulate you on becoming a man finally. Just kidding. Can you hear us still, Gerdo? Are you still there?
Yep, I think we definitely can't hear or see Gerdo now.
Okay, there he is.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. Happens all the time.
So I guess
well, terror stories. Back at Six Nations and back at Chiefs Woods. We'll start with Chiefs Woods first.
Okay, Chisu Park.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Chisu Park is located on the north shoreline of the Grand River on the northern end of Six Nations Reserve. And the reason why I included Chiefswood Park is because it's a place that has public access. And so one of the things that I've experienced in trying to run programming and teach not only our own people, but visitors about our connection to the land and to the plants and to the river is that we don't have a lot of public access in our community to these places. And so Chiefswood Park is one of those places that we can access as a community. And there are some interesting ecological features there that we can see. So the Six Nations of the Grand River, Sway is what we refer to it as, is part of the Carolinian Forest Zone. And so the Carolinian Forest is a forest type or ecotype that is associated with plants that are on the southernmost point of Canada and Ontario. And so that big green square you see there, that's actually one of the largest tracts of Carolinian forest in Canada right now. And so it's at risk because our population here in Six Nations is the largest First Nations population in Canada, and it's growing year by year. It's been growing now for quite a few decades. And so we are at a point where we're having to basically utilize the forest zone to live and to expand our homes and for our children and people who are young, like people in their 20s and my age who are in their 30s are needing space to build houses for their families. And so the forests here are suffering because of that. And a lot of it is, like I said, private land, and we don't have a lot of public access that we can see these forests and connect to them. And so Chiefswood Park is one of those places. Another place adjacent to the park or across Highway 54, I think was pinned on the map as well, is Six Nations Tourism, which also has a nature trail. It's one of the, I think we have two main nature trails in Six Nations that we can access publicly, and so that's one of them. And so it's a challenge for us, or for me, to develop programming and to bring people out onto the land, is because where we have access to a lot of times is agricultural. You can see all of the agricultural fields surrounding Chiefswood Park, and Kayanase, which is actually just down the road, is an old agricultural area, and that's modern agriculture. What we also refer to as industrial agriculture. And so it's just a patchwork of forest and agricultural fields. And Chiefswood Park also has a good selection of native trees that are associated with the Carolinian zones. The Carolinian forest is identified by the what the type of plants and trees that occur here indicates that we're connected to more of a southern forest zone. And as you go down across the border into New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that's where you see a lot of the species that grow in southern Ontario. You see those occurring more and more as you go further south. Mm-hmm. And so in Chiefswood Park and Six Nations Tourism are places where you can see trees that belong to the Carolinian zone, things like the shagbark hickory, the black walnut, hackberry trees.
Kayanase has a lot of our indigenous plants there too at the greenhouse, because it's not just cultural sort of tourism. It's also a greenhouse, and that keeps a lot of the seeds there. And we have the seed exchange as well. And when does that happen again, Kerdo? The seed exchange, can you hear me? What happened to our sound here?
There you go.
Oh, okay.
So Kayanase, where our operation is based, is an ecological restoration company. And so that's actually where I started. I started working in the field, planting trees and gathering seed from wild trees and plants and grasses, things like that. And we go to places that are disturbed by construction or large-scale projects, and we go and restore portions of those places that have been disturbed by planting trees and applying native seed and trying to bring it back to something that resembles a native habitat. Another type of work that we do is invasive species removal. So we have a lot of invasive species in our community and in the surrounding area. So we work to try to limit those in the areas where we're planting. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
Over the course of the years you've been working there, how many trees do you think you personally planted?
Personally, well, I started in 2007, and we were planting not only trees, but grasses and herbaceous plants, and we're also doing nuts and seeds, so like acorns, hickory nuts, those type of things. So if I were to add it all together, it's probably more over 3,000, maybe closer to 5,000 over the years, just with my own hands planted. There are places where I can go back and see some of the trees. It's been over 10 years now, and they're 30 feet tall. Some of these trees I planted. So yeah, I've
planted a forest by yourself.
Yeah, pretty much, I guess. Yeah.
I worked there at Kayanase too. We've also met a lot of people from all over the world and showed them how to utilize our different techniques and a lot of our different culture techniques as well. Like we did the the seed bombs with those scientists from the conference, and we did that with the Indigenous conference as well. And they came from New Zealand, Australia, Kenya, people from some people from Mexico as well, from Mexico City, and a lot of different types of Ongwehongwe from all across Turtle Island. But we're kind of running short on time here, Kerdo. I know, and we really have to cut it short. But if you want to know more about what Kerdo had done, you can call him at Kayanase and visit the Kayanase website at kayanase.ca, right?
Yeah, you can Google Kayanase, you can Google OSTTC Longhouse. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're on social media.
And okay.
Yeah, come out to the site, come visit for sure.
Yeah, but we just want to get the last part of our show going here, which is the conversation here. And we want to get the if the audience is still there, if there's any questions for Kerdo, Rudo, or Arvol, comment them in the comment section. And or if Rudo has any questions for Kerdo, or if Kerdo has any questions for Rudo, you guys are able to talk to each other now if you guys would like to.
But in the meantime, I think it's since it's about water, do you want to say a little bit about the Grand River and their history with the Grand River and their relationship with it?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So our ancestral lands, right, are over in New York State, and we arrived in the Grand River in 1784. We started making our way here into the Grand River because of the American Revolution and the Clinton-Sullivan campaign, and so that's how we ended up here in the Grand River anyway. And we established villages in the lower reaches of the river throughout the early 1800s, and so what we see, and when I've spoken to archaeologists and some of the people from our community, is that the villages were built and established along the river, and they would most of the time plant their crops across the river. So these villages were living sustainably by growing our traditional corn, beans, and squash, sunflowers, and other wild plants that we used in cultivation. And so that's a little bit of our history. And when we look at the watershed, we see that there's a lot of agriculture, and so there's been a lot of deforestation. And at one point in the 1920s, I believe it was down to about 5% of the original forest cover. So during the mid 1800s, a lot of the land was being leased off to settlers from Europe and loyalists from the Americas, and they bring their Euro-American style of farming, which is to clear cut the land and use all the wood in mills and to be sold off. And then they drain all the wetlands and swamps, which actually keeps our river and our fishing grounds healthy, to be converted to large-scale agriculture. And so that's what we see still to this day on the map. from what I understand, the forest cover over the past about 100 years, 80 to 100 years, has recovered to about 20 to 25%. And so the aim is 30%. That's considered a healthy forest cover for a watershed is 30%. And so it's close. It's getting there. But as we're getting closer to that landmark of 30%, we're also seeing an increase in urban sprawl happening in the watershed as well. So there's over 1 million people in the Grand River watershed. And so a lot of our community and a lot of the communities use the river. And so our historical relationship was that we came here and established sustainable villages along the river and utilized the surrounding area for hunting and gathering our food and gathering sap to make maple syrup. And a lot of that is passed down through oral tradition as well. So yeah, there's a lot of history of our existence in the Grand River. We do actually have native prairies as well. It's not just forest. So if you go to Chisu Park, there's also a native tall grass prairie that was established there in the early 1990s, and you can see some of the native grasses that occur there. So that connects us back to our brothers in the West, our Arvol there, and you know, the grasslands that as part of their traditional territory also occur here as well. We maintain the grasslands for hunting and the savannas for hunting, just as they did there, and so that's a connection that we have with the people and all across North America, the indigenous peoples, that we had this relationship. We managed the land so that it could provide and it benefited not only us as humans, but it benefited the animals and the birds and our all of the ecology that exists there. And so you can go to Chisu Park and see those things. That's why I pinned that on the map there.
Yeah,
and it connects us to history.
I mean, you know a lot about the environment in Six Nations. Do you know if you personally, have you noticed any changes because of climate change and the like pollution effects on the environment in that area?
Well, yeah. Well, there's a lot that happens in nature that so in Six Nations, part of our, well, not just Six Nations, but part of indigenous land use is to burn the fields down and to maintain grasslands with fire. And so we haven't been doing that because we have fire bans that have been affecting us for a few decades now. And that's affected the ecology. So we don't hear a lot of the species that we used to. Even when I was a kid in the early 90s, I remember hearing meadowlarks. The eastern and western meadowlarks were common. And I remember hearing that call when I was a kid, and now they're still around, but they're not in as much abundance as they used to be, because a lot of the grassland that was maintained is grown in, or it's been reconverted to agriculture for growing tobacco, stuff like that. Things that were really common just when I was, like I said, when I was a kid, like barn swallows, there's actually a species at risk. Both of those birds are species at risk because we've changed the way that we interact with the land, and there's more pesticides being used, and so a lot of these birds are consuming insects in large quantities in the summertime, and they're migrating in from South America. That connects us down with our people in South America, because some of the birds that migrate here are coming from South America, the neotropical birds, and so we're all connected to each other through the ecology. And so that's what I noticed, is that some of the species composition has changed because of succession and overgrowth, and we're not maintaining those grasslands like we used to. So there were actually vast grasslands in our surrounding Six Nations that we used as hunting areas and would maintain with fire, oak savannas and tall grass prairie.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And basically around here too, because our land is so developed and they've been colonizing here for such a long time, you know, that even those recent years, it's just been more and more amped up. And we've been losing a lot more and more of what things that we used to identify with as the coming of summer, spring, winter, and fall and stuff like that. So, Beardo's one of those old guys now, so just kidding.
Yeah, the river itself, another thing I noticed is the amount of ice cover that we get in the winter isn't the same. The river doesn't freeze like it used to, and the lakes don't freeze. And so we get these rain events and melting that happens throughout the winter, and we have a lot more erosion happening on the river itself, and the banks have been eroding in the past 2 decades. And so at Chisu Park, you can also go there and see we've lost a few feet of shoreline in the past maybe 7 years due to flooding throughout the winter and massive floods that we're getting due to these large storms that are happening due to, I guess, climate change.
It's really affecting the health of our river as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And you can tell that, when you see things like that, it's just really like they're self-fulfilling prophecies. Because there's not many people who really know that old language and all those old knowledge anymore. So it's kind of sad, But the more bottlenecked that information is, the harder the people stand up. The stronger those people are. Just like Gerdo.
Yeah, do you think that map like to bring it back to Rudo, do you think that if you've caught any of his presentation that mapping will help Six Nations?
Yeah, definitely, because when you're mapping areas and you're able to identify or even get a baseline of what the habitat looks like now, we can keep track of the changes that are occurring as the years go by, and we can identify what needs to be protected and how it's important to us, how it's significant to us, whether it's medicine or has some kind of ceremonial value to us.
Mm-hmm. Rudo, do you have any questions for Gerdo? And Gerdo, do you have any questions for Rudo?
For Rudo, I really liked his presentation. I've always had a fascination with the people in the Amazon and in South America, and I think it's really amazing that he's actually been there and been able to work with them and help them to map their territories. I've spent a lot of time in my research watching whatever I can as far as documentaries and information about the practices of the people and the Amazon, and it is very much similar to the way that we grow our own food and historically grow our own food. At Chisu Park, I keep mentioning it, but there's a plant that grows there, Apios americana. It's like a wild potato, right? And so we used to gather those roots and plant those roots and those rhizomes in future village sites where we'd let it establish. And once we moved our village to that area, those plants would be growing and flourishing. And I see that same practice in a lot of the research I've done in people in South America, including the Jingo people he mentioned. Yeah, that's right up my alley. I enjoyed his presentation.
Kerdo, I'm super amazed by your work as well, man. I mean, as you were talking, I was, I don't know if you noticed, but I was in the background kind of zooming in and out of Terra stories, partially out of personal curiosity because I wanted to see the park that you were talking about with such such detail about the different plants and the different trees that you have planted in that area. And it looks like an amazing place that I definitely have to check out next time I'm at Six Nations. So a lot of respect for your work and everything that you've done. It's really sort of vital to keep the watershed healthy.
Yeah, for sure.
So Garrett, I'm curious, did you learn a lot from like your parents as well, or from like your family about the ecosystem? You build all this knowledge that you have about like all this traditional ecological knowledge as well.
A little bit, yeah. My father was the one who introduced me to identifying trees and some of the historical and ceremonial knowledge that he learned throughout his life. He shared with me, and I also went to school and learned a lot about the ecology in Ontario and Canada. And the more I learned about the scientific aspect, and the more I was able to connect it back to what I learned from not only my father and my mother, but growing native crops and how to utilize our own medicines and plants. I also learned some of that from my grandparents. My grandmother used to make medicine and she would talk about some of the plants, and my grandfather would be out with us when we were tapping trees together, maple syrup. He showed me a lot of the trees as well. And so that's kind of, where it started. And I've learned from other people along the way, and we've had a lot of recording of information that's happened here in the past 100 years, and I've been able to access that information that was recorded in detail of what people were doing here prior to 1920, as far as utilizing the land here and the water.
Really impressive.
Have you, sorry, I just want to know if you have any recommendations, because our water, or I guess to Kerdo, any recommendations on how like we can get our water healthy again? Because our is so contaminated, and so is Boston Creek, and so is the Grand River. And I know that it's going to have to be big changes, and like getting all of the contaminants out of the water, and all the contaminants to go flowing into the water. But like, I guess if it would be on a small scale, do you know like any plants that filter water?
There are a lot of wetland plants that play a role in reducing nutrients and capturing nutrients, and also toxins as well, or contaminants. And that's an area of study that I explored while I was in school, using constructive wetlands to not only mitigate flooding, but also to capture nutrients from agriculture, and to reduce runoff from mining industries and other industrial industries. So there are definitely plants out there that play a role in buffering some of the contaminants that can come into the water. What was the other part of your question? Was that the main thing?
I think that's the main thing, yeah.
Yeah. And as far as, I think it was, how can we sort of help it, or how can we contribute? Or I think one of the main things that I found is education, like going out and actually learning what's living in the river. So right from the invertebrates and insects that live in the water, like the mussels, and the plants, identifying the plants and their relationship, and the birds that are nesting there. When you can identify all of that and how it connects to where you live, you're more responsible to it now, because you understand it a lot more. And so, like for myself, when I was a kid growing up, I used to go all over the reserve and hunting and exploring the forests there along the river and the creeks, and I would find heron rookeries, so places where all the herons are nesting together, and that's actually considered a provincially significant wetland when you find that. And so I found those in the community, and those are things that I think as like the everyday person should understand and be able to identify. And once we have that understanding set into the community on a large scale, I think it would be better equipped to question the developments and to question any sort of large scale operation we're going to do here in the community. Or even on a personal level, if you're building a house, what's the species you can save, or what kind of trees can you establish on your property to help the wildlife, stuff like that.
I think it's definitely a big thing that you just said, like to make
question
sure.
Even.
Yeah. To make sure, like, our environment that we're building our houses, or that we're
just so we're more
occupying.
Self-aware of like what we do ourselves, and that's it's really like where the accountability starts, is self acknowledgement as to what you're doing to the world. And that's why we have the terror stories as well, so you're actually more able to relate to the earth and to the land as your own family member, basically. That's why we call her Mother Earth. That's why we call it, our cousins, our relatives out there, the trees and all the medicines and all the animals and stuff like that. So Yahweh Kerdo.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for all your knowledge You both are super cool, and I bet if you ever met in person, if Rudo ever came down to Six Nations, we can definitely set up a lunch or a meeting or something.
Yeah, you guys would be like the meeting of like, what was that guy's name? Sigmund Freud and what's the other guy's name? The other philosopher where they talk for 13 hours straight. That would
Oh,
be.
Carl Jung.
I knew his name was Carl. You guys would be talking 13 hours straight.
And I know that Rudo's coming back because we're going to be doing that mapping here in Six Nations eventually, and I think Gyro can definitely come in handy for that.
Yeah. So
Definitely.
Oh, I'll definitely be back. I'm really looking forward to it and exploring the landscape again and just sort of seeing it with new eyes from everything I've learned today as well, and just keep learning because this is incredible. And I'd love to keep involved in supporting the mapping and the whole process of land reclamation and, you know, figuring out where the water is polluted and how it aligns with the traditional knowledge of the lands as well. So, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you, Kerdo, especially after today.
Yeah, definitely.
What we wanted to develop was sensing systems that can then sense things in the environment and then wirelessly report it. And this can be then put on a website that the community could access. And the idea being that then the community knows what is happening in their environment, in the water bodies that they are concerned about, and then could potentially benefit from something like this. The other idea is also to combine this knowledge that we are getting from the sensor with the traditional knowledge and to present both of that in the same sort of interface that the user is going to use. And one of my colleagues is working in that regard.
Yeah. I'm going to use Cayuga and Mohawk language, right?
Yes, so that's the initial plan, and then subsequently to expand beyond that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So the community can make these sensors?
Yes, that's the plan for now. So the first part is on the low cost sensing systems where we are looking at the electronics behind transmitting the information, right? But then we are still going to use traditional sensors that are not necessarily low enough in cost, right? The second part, as we've identified, is to take these traditional sensors and to come up with new technologies that could make them even lower in cost, maybe 10 times lower in cost, and also facilitate their fabrication or construction of these sensors by the community itself, right? Yeah. And one example of these new sensing systems is what you see in the bottom right-hand corner, a sensor that we've developed for free chlorine. So this is, again, an input that we receive from the community that drinking water is primarily very important, and the quality of the drinking water, especially in the wells and the cisterns, and its monitoring is important for the health of the community, and therefore free chlorine and the levels associated with it were considered important. So what we developed is a sensor that could potentially use something as simple as a pencil, right? So we have often written using pencil on paper, and that leaves a trace. Pencil lead is a good source of a material called graphite, or a thin film form of what is called graphene. And we make these sensors out of basically pencil lead written onto a substrate, and that is capable of sensing free chlorine in drinking water, which is useful to identify whether there is enough free chlorine to kill the bacteria that may be present in the water itself. Another technology that we're looking at is these aptamers. These are DNA molecules that actually bind to metal atoms that may be present in water. And therefore, when they bind, they light up. And so it is very similar to fireflies lighting up. And so suddenly we can see something in the dark. That means that the firefly is around. In a similar way, if you see a glow in the water with these aptamers present in it, you will be able to identify that that particular metal ion, such as say mercury or arsenic or lead, is present in the water itself. And so what we are trying to do is to integrate these designs, these new designs of sensors, which are low cost, into something that can be potentially used in the community, and then combined with these sensing and transmission systems of signals in order to make low cost sensing systems. Next slide, please.
Just one moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we do have a question here. The question is, what will be done with the evidence of the sensors? Meaning, will you know the source of the contamination?
So that is again for the community to decide. So these sensors are meant to be sensors that the community can take and deploy wherever they want to be deployed, right? So it's typically the water bodies that are important for consumption of water, or sacred areas, for example. These are where the community would want to monitor. And then if you keep monitoring upstream from that, based on that information, you will be able to trace the source of something that is contaminating, right? And that is the purpose of some of the other groups in the Global Water Futures that are investigating different nutrient levels as well as heavy metal levels along a complete watershed, and that will give them information on where these parameters are changing, and that could give an indication of where the
I think
contamination
it's being uploaded to the app, and it's being uploaded to which app? It's going to be uploaded to the app, and it's going to be available for community, basically.
On Onegana's website?
Yeah.
That's part of the effort that one of my colleagues in that larger team is undertaking. So far we are sort of in the middle of this effort before COVID-19 sort of completely stopped it. Where we have some of the sensors that have already been field deployed. So what you see in the top left corner is it's an oxygen sensor that has been deployed for about 2 years now in terms of monitoring oxygen in soil. We also have a smart node, a wireless transmission system that has been loaded up, and we did some preliminary testing in Six Nations before the shutdown happened. And what you see in the bottom is something that we are developing. So this is an example of a pill type sensor. It comes in sort of round beads. It's similar to the beads that go into baby diapers, right? And the nice thing with these baby diapers is they absorb a lot of water, but along with water, they also absorb contaminants, heavy metals, for instance. And so what you see is one of those beads that have been added to with a dye that is sensitive, in this case to copper. And what it shows is the different levels of copper that is present in the water that is seen. And so what you see is a very visual demonstration. And then with a cell phone, you can take an image of one of these beads, compare it with other beads of similar color, and then identify what is the concentration of copper. What we want to do is to extend this to harmful elements like lead and arsenic and mercury. And with that, what you can do is you can take sample of water anywhere that you are interested in, put a drop of bead into that, and that will then change color. And then by taking a picture of that bead, you should be able to tell the concentration of that particular contaminant that is present in the water. And then it is up to the community then to identify where they want to go and measure. And our hope is that the community will then go on to measure over a wide area and accumulate this information onto the website, so that we now have a geographical information over seasons and over time on how these contamination levels are changing. And this could be a community-driven science in terms of accumulating information that is important for the community. And through that, we know certain facts that may not necessarily be evident before. Right.
Yes.
So that's sort of the entire purpose of this low-cost method of sensing, is to empower the community in order to make that information available without necessarily somebody outside from the community actually coming and telling what it is. Right?
Yeah, that's really good. You know, it makes the community more aware, self-aware, basically, of
Yep.
what they do and then what has already been done. So that's amazing. I really like that idea. And also, you know, like one person's time amplifies, you know, your time basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great system. Yeah, because now it's in the hands of the people basically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Now
Yeah.
it makes me think that I actually know what's
We're
going
actually
on.
helping ourselves. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is what we call as democratizing science, so that everybody can contribute, and through that the effort becomes massive compared to the only things that we can do, right? So
Yeah, and also I heard that you were doing the what is it, the artificial tissue as well. Yeah, can you just tell me just a little bit about it? I know it's like it's a big
Just
subject. Yeah,
curious.
I'm just a little curious. Yeah.
yeah, so what we are trying to do is in the field of regenerative medicine. So I'm a professor in mechanical engineering, and so in mechanical engineering we build things. So just like with Lego, for example, we take these bricks
Oh, I
and
love
assemble
that.
these bricks to build bigger and complex structures. What we are trying to do is essentially the same thing. We are trying to build with cells, and so we are trying to assemble different cells in different places in order to build three-dimensional structures that could then function like organs. And the eventual hope in this research is to create tissue-like structures that can then be used to treat people who have weakened organs or organs that are not functioning, and to serve as replacement organs, so that lifespan could be extended, or people can live healthy and high quality life for long.
Yeah, so this is not giving an excuse to anybody just to keep going and then run your, you know, kidney or liver right. You know, you're not going to get this new liver and then do the whole same thing over. No, this is something for you to continue, you know, change your life basically, you know.
Absolutely. The original one is the best. Nature, you cannot beat nature. That's always the case.
Yes.
Yeah. We have a question here. Where is the question? Okay, question. How can I order a sensor kit for my community?
So what we are hoping to do in this particular project is to actually develop and validate that sensor. So these things, for example, right now what we have done is to show that these beads that we're using can work with copper. We still have to create these beads for materials or elements that are important for the community, like lead and arsenic and mercury. What we are hoping to do is to follow this up with another translational type of project, where we could then take this technology that has already been developed and train community members in order to synthesize or make these kinds of sensors, and then to develop standard operating procedures that they could then and also in the native languages, so that they could then use these things. So that is a different scope, which is basically knowledge translation in this case, and that will also involve community involvement and input into how this training can happen in a suitable way. And that is what we want to do as a follow-up.
Yeah, so like you're saying that if you give a fish to a man, he eats for a day, but if you teach the man how to fish, he never goes hungry again. That's basically what you're saying. You're going to give like the directions to the people. That's a lot better way of doing things rather than just giving them the thing. Because if you just give it to them, you know, people don't always, you know, follow up with the info, and you know they kind of get lazy or they forget about it, you know. But if they do it themselves, you know, they take the time to do it, then they're definitely going to be on it. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah. And how did you actually start like with the whole engineering, you know? How did you become how do I become an engineer? 'Cause I've always wanted to be one.
The way to become an engineer is to be really bad at sports. So my goal, my goal originally, when I was in high school, was to become a cricketer. And in India, cricket is similar to, I would say, basketball or baseball in North America, or hockey here in Canada. So that was the case. And then I quickly realized that I would not be able to make the cut into my state team. And because of that, I redirected the energies into studying. And so the key thing is not to be good in sports.
that's a great, that's a lot of people I can think of right off the bat. Oh man, it's been great talking to you, Doctor.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me. And it's a fantastic program that both of you have created.
So this is the Science Minute. So as Makasa introduced, I'm Charles. I'm a professor of chemical engineering at McMaster University. I've got a lab at McMaster University, a bunch of grad students. I work under the Global Water Futures project, and that's a project that has linked me with Professor Don Martin Hill. And between the two of us, many other professors in nursing, in biology, in psychology, in anthropology. And this multifaceted team has targeted or attempted to target how to or figure out what's happening on First Nations land, specifically with respect to their water. So moving forward, just a quick introduction about myself. This is my grandmother and my grandfather. I would say I come from a long line of strong women. My grandmother was very strong-willed, but also very brilliant. She was an early computer programmer, one of the first female programmers in Canada.
That's cool.
She was a scientist in our family, and she really paved the way for strong female leads. And moving forward, my mother, you can see where we get curly hair in the family. The picture there. That's my mother doing her PhD, which is a little bit different than mine. But she was also a very strong woman. She was not a scientist, but an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and spent a lot of time working with First Nations people, trying to help them with land claims, and worked on lots of land claim cases. So it was really heartening for me to hear that for the Haudenosaunee, women are the keepers of water. And women are really the ones who lead a lot of the environmental progress on First Nations communities. So it's sort of maybe coincidental, maybe just part of fate that the strong line of women continues in this environmental breadth. So the team that I help lead includes Makasa and her brother Cody and Denise McQueen. These are part of our community liaison individuals. They help us connect with First Nations at Six Nations. They help us work with the key people, key stakeholders. And on the second row are the collection of students that have done a lot of the data collection, a lot of the analysis. I'm just there as an advisor and really helping them along in their analysis. So we have Nan, Eric, Kyle, Hannah, and Panos. What's exciting, I think, and what's very opportune is that there's an equal mix of men and women on this team. So 50-50 split. What's a little bit problematic is that the lower line, Nan, Eric, Kyle, Hannah, and Panos, none of them are from Six Nations, none of them are First Nations themselves. And I would love to have or find First Nations engineers or scientists or chemists that are interested in helping with this project, because I think we can only do so much as allies. We've had great help with people that are from the reserve, but really building out that technical expertise is really what we'd like to provide for First Nations individuals. So bringing First Nations individuals on board, helping to disseminate our techniques, our information, is really a massive part of this effort.
So you're saying if there's any engineers, or who are you looking for?
That's right. So I am currently hiring grad students for this project. And especially I'd be happy to find engineers, chemists, environmental scientists who might want to work in the lab, work in the field, learn how we analyze these samples in my lab. And really, I think an exciting way is to figure out, can we find mergers between traditional or Haudenosaunee ways of analyzing the environment and the ways that I've learned, my ways? Can we find some merger? Can we find some ways that can be really culturally appropriate? I think that'd be very exciting.
I'd be all for that. Sign me up for that.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, so if anybody has
my email and we have to, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying if anybody has any friends or family who fit that description, then hit up Charles. You can go up to our Facebook page and say, hey, I have this family member who is doing that kind of work and maybe I can link you guys up. Then that could help.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so.
So what are we doing? So the first thing is, where are the water problems? Well, we know that there's lots of pollution happening in First Nations waters. Last count, there were over 100 communities still on boil water advisories and drinking water advisories throughout Canada. There are lots of cases actually where there's contamination, but it just hasn't actually been reported or identified and gone to the federal government. So there are probably even more cases than the ones I've just listed. So we know that First Nations are suffering from water contamination. And if you go forward, what we want to do is first identify what that contamination is. So the project that I've been working on is to help First Nations people. This is a little heavy metal joke. Help First Nations people figure out what's going on with their water, what the contamination might be. And once you can detect and analyze what's happening, then you can come up with a solution for that specific contaminant. So the first step is, let's analyze what the problem is. And the second step is, let's figure out a treatment or a solution to this problem. If we move to the next. So what are the problems that we run into? Well, first of all, it's not just the types of contaminants, which can be uncertain or varied. There are varying environmental conditions. There's an unknown, not just amount of contamination, but rate of contamination. And oftentimes this contamination, especially in First Nations communities, can be in very remote locations, so hard to get to. For example, another community that Professor Don Martin Hill is working with, the Lubicon in Alberta, way up in northern Alberta, is quite challenging to get to. And they have severe environmental contamination. So it adds an extra layer of complexity for scientists or engineers to work in those environments.
Yeah, because of the pipelines, right?
That's right, yeah. So there's lots of oil and gas fields nearby. And the strong suspicion, if not confirmed evidence, is that a lot of that operation is causing massive contamination to their environment, to their waterways. So those are some of the detection challenges that we run into. Thankfully, at Six Nations, it's a little bit easier. You're nearby, so we can start with this easier community, figure out what's happening with this First Nation, and hopefully expand some of those techniques to other neighboring First Nations and beyond. So for those that are not familiar, although I'm sure a lot of people know, the Six Nations is the largest First Nations community by population in Canada. They built a state-of-the-art water treatment facility back in 2014 for $41 million. This is an amazing, as an engineer, it's a great thing to see. It's a really high-tech type of water system. Unfortunately, there are two problems with it. One is it's currently only connected to 10% of the population, because that's the only amount of money that the federal government gave to connect the state-of-the-art water treatment plant to the community. So they have this beautiful water treatment plant, and yet it can only service a small fraction of the community. And approximately 90% of the other population on Six Nations Reserve relies on bottled water, cisterns, which are essentially concrete bunkers that people fill with water, or groundwater wells. So wells they have dug themselves or they've had contractors dig. You can see here in this photograph, this is a pretty traditional concrete well that you find across Six Nations and in many other rural communities, non-centralized communities across Ontario.
Yeah, do you want to explain how it's a human right that all people should have running clean water hooked up to their homes? Right now, yeah, definitely only 10% of Six Nations, like my home is hooked up to the water treatment plant. So
Mine is as well.
yeah, so we have clean water coming from our taps, but the other 90% of our Six Nations reserve doesn't have that. So they also have struggles with paying for
the water to be trucked in,
to have the piping piped up to their house. So there's lots of
obstacles and different financial problems that always arise.
Yeah, like single mothers and elders can't carry a big jug of water into the house, right? So that is a struggle for our people here in Six Nations on a daily basis. Like we shouldn't have to like rely, like we don't know who's gonna, if someone's available to bring you water, right? And what their schedule is like. And so there's these stressors of every day trying to get clean water. And there's just people who asked on Facebook, hey, can someone bring me water today? And if nobody answers, then guess what? They're gonna
have no water.
They're gonna have no water.
Maybe for a week, maybe a couple of weeks. I know my auntie, she comes to my house basically on a daily basis to fill bottles up of water. So she have, water at her house just to clean herself with, not even to drink or anything. She needs it to clean herself or wash her dishes or stuff like that. And she comes in basically almost on a daily basis and maybe every other day to refill her water supply.
So I think you're making a really good point, which is a lot of people have a misconception that, well, you just get bottled water. What's the big deal? But you can't shower in contaminated water.
No, you can't.
There's not enough bottles of water available to pour over your body to wash. You can't wash your dishes or your apples in contaminated water. You can't have a home birth in contaminated water. And these are real daily hindrances for communities. And especially even if all the individuals on Six Nations or other First Nations communities had perfectly good well water, that doesn't necessarily mean that they want that source of water. Why couldn't they have the same ease or availability that might come to other municipalities? And I think what's lacking here is options. It's possible, and I know I've talked to some people at Six Nations that they don't want to drink the water from the water treatment plant because they observe it as overly chemically treated, and that's fine, right? But there are no other options. You either drive to a central depot and get this chemically treated water, or you're rolling the dice, drinking potentially contaminated well water. And so this is really the problem, that if there are no options on the reserve, then it really hinders people's livelihood, it hinders people's psychology, and it really is disruptive to community.
Before this treatment plant went up, everybody, had to have well water or had to go to the creek and had to boil water, and that was the way it was for a very, very, very long time.
2014 is not that long ago. That's years ago.
And before this, I lived off of that well water. I used to live on the corner there, and that's where we got our water, was from a well for the longest time. And everybody that I know, like basically like my age and older, they've all grown up on well water.
Yeah, that's again limiting options. So for a fairly large community, 12 to 20,000 or so people, that's a fairly large community to be living on individual wells. Communities of that size throughout Ontario will often have maybe not a full water treatment plant, but a centralized well that's managed and connected. So that there definitely is a discrepancy between what's happening at Six Nations and what's happening at a lot of other communities around Ontario.
Yeah, and not only are we having to survive off of that, potentially contaminated water, but all of our fresh water, our groundwater has been stolen from us. Well, was up until, Makasha put her foot down, and actually got things moving along in a positive direction, not just having to go down and, being stagnant, like I heard this quote, um, staying still, is death, you always have to keep moving forward, and basically, she kind of was pushing us in the right direction. So, without these, outside influences or people, standing up for us, giving each other a voice, we'd still, have potentially contaminated water, and our groundwater or our well water, and having to pay, to have all that water trucked in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these are really, these are pressing concerns. They weren't, problems back in the 70s. These are problems happening currently. And again, it's not just Six Nations, it's First Nations across Canada that are experiencing this kind of veritable drought, in their homes. So we go to the next slide. We learned that Six Nations and a lot of other First Nations have water quality concerns. And mostly that was concern around groundwater wells, but also concerns about natural waters flowing in and around the reserve. And in this exploration of water on the reserve, we found not just problems with the major river that flows through the Six Nations Reserve, which is the Grand River, not just people as well as cisterns, but also other smaller creeks that flow through the reserve, which have very high concentrations of bacteria and potentially other kind of contaminants. So again, this is an example of environmental racism. It's not a coincidence that First Nations communities often have much worse water quality than a lot of other communities. It's not a coincidence that First Nations communities have poorly functioning wells or wastewater treatment plants. These are actually at the best case scenario, neglectful, and the worst case scenario, intentional disregard for people's livelihood. So you can see here some outlay pipes which have poorly treated water flowing into a creek on the reserve. You can see another picture of people's groundwater wells, and down at the bottom is the picture of the Six Nations Reserve, with that blue line on the top, the Grand River flowing past it or through it. So the first thing we did was we analyzed people's groundwater through their wells and cisterns. So you go to the next slide. What we found was pretty concerning. We sampled a pseudo-random selection of wells, primarily from people volunteering to have their wells and cisterns checked. We measured people's tap water, people's water directly from the wells, people's water from cisterns. And what we found was both contamination from bacteria, and that'll be discussed by the biologist if she comes on for this Let's Talk About Water. And my team discovered not just contamination by bacteria, but also contamination by heavy metals. One of the major concerns was mercury contamination. In one of the worst wells that we analyzed, there was over 8 micrograms per liter of mercury. And the Canadian national guideline is less than 1 microgram of mercury per liter, absolute maximum. So one of these wells had 8 times the amount of mercury. And what we analyzed was, of all the water sources we sampled, over 30% had mercury near to or above the guideline. So you can see this map of First Nations, of the Six Nations community. All the red dots are wells or locations where water sources had higher than guideline mercury levels. All the yellow dots were near to those limits, which is still unacceptable. And in fact, these limits for mercury are somewhat arbitrarily determined. They're determined by a few scientific papers, and we set a limit that's sort of reasonable to treat in the rest of Canada, which is less than 1 micrograms per liter. And some of this is, of course, this is based on scientific evidence and scientific analyses, but really this is all the red and yellow dots that we measured, all the wells and cisterns that we measured had totally unacceptable levels of consistent mercury. And mercury is a problem because it's a toxic heavy metal. So it can cause neurological damage over prolonged exposure. It can cause problems with your nervous system. And over a single dose is not going to kill you, but prolonged exposure over the course of a lifetime, or even less than that, over several years, can cause significant health effects. So we wanted to go back and reassess these wells, find out if the mercury concentrations were fluctuating, if they were changing, and then analyze other people's wells. Unfortunately, COVID interrupted some of those analyses, but we're starting those analyses up again as soon as we can, hopefully in August or this month, or maybe in September. And what we really need is people to allow us to come in, take samples from their taps, take samples from their wells and cisterns, and let us know if they know of any concerns with their water, if they have any concerns with their water. That will really help us to do a fulsome analysis. And we can share that data with anyone that's volunteering. And we've shared this data with Band Council already, and with the Confederacy. And we are very concerned about these results. But it's not just all bad news. We want to now, next stage, figure out how can people treat this water? How can people start finding alternative sources of water that would be better? And what are some local techniques or technologies that we can start brainstorming to treat and filter this mercury out of people's water? And then the next question is, why is there mercury on the reserve? So if you go to the next slide, again, this is a really nice example of environmental racism. The river flows down, so just stop here in the slide. The river flows down, the Grand River flows down from north to south through much of Ontario into Lake Erie. And you can see that it flows past a bunch of large cities. Flows near to Guelph. Guelph has an estuary that combines with the Grand River. Flows by Waterloo, Kitchener, Cambridge, Brantford, and eventually, in the next click, flows past Six Nations of the Grand River. So really, Six Nations is at the tail end, at the bottom of a lot of industrialized cities. And all of these cities are dumping wastewater into the Grand River. All those green dots on that map represent wastewater treatment plants that spill their water into the Grand River. Now, that wastewater is treated for the most part, treated up to a level that we've deemed as a Western society to be acceptable for releasing into an environment. But what they don't tell you very often is that under rainstorms, under large water events, like a heavy rainstorm or a storm, a lot of raw, untreated sewage will be dumped into the river because they overflow the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant. And so for the past, this is a very, what you can see is this is a very industrialized river. It's been treated basically like a garbage dump for 100 years. Only in the 70s and 80s have we started to treat water that's flowing into the Grand River. And yet our current technologies don't treat all the wastewaters that are flowing into the Grand River. We still have these overflow contamination events. And all that is flowing right past and right through the Six Nations Reserve. And again, it's not a coincidence that we don't care what we dump downstream of our neighbors. And especially if those neighbors are poor or Indigenous or Black or otherwise marginalized, there's even less of a care if you dump poorly treated water into those important riverways. And I think what's really a travesty, I mean, if that was enough to break someone's heart, what's really a travesty, I think, is how important water is for the Haudenosaunee. In this project, I've learned really intimately, not just for the Haudenosaunee, but for a lot of other First Nations groups, how important water is to their culture, to their spirituality, to their everyday life. And if you then contaminate this water such that you divorce those peoples from this life source, from this lifeblood, you tell them, oh, by the way, sorry, we contaminated it. You can no longer use it in the way that you wanted to. You can no longer fish there. You can no longer swim there. That's another way of rupturing a culture, another way of, whether it's intentionally or not, again, in the worst case, it's entirely negligent. In the best case, it's entirely negligent. In the worst case, it's intentional rupturing of someone's culture. And I think a really nice point is, if you click on the next slide, if you overlay the Haldimand Tract, everyone knows at Six Nations what the Haldimand Tract is. It's a large chunk of land that was given or bequeathed to the Six Nations.
Oh, so you can take it back. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's land that was given to the Six Nations peoples, and for their honorable serving in the invasion of Canada by the United States. And if you look at the Hellman Tract, what does it follow? It follows the entire length of the Grand River. So at one point, the Six Nations owned and ruled and controlled the entire Grand River. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence. One of the reasons I think is because the Grand River was so important, so critical to the Haudenosaunee way of being. And for us to have contaminated that so detrimentally, in fact, the Grand River was one of the worst, most contaminated rivers in all of North America up until a decade or so ago.
Wow.
And for us to do that is really tragic.
That's a lot of rivers.
Yeah, there's a lot of rivers in North America, and this was one of the worst. On par with the river that lit on fire in Cleveland.
Wow, that's crazy.
Thankfully, in the past 20 years or so, there's been the Grand River Conservation Authority, the GRCA, the Grand River Conservation Authority, which is made up of allies along this Grand River from Waterloo, from Kitchener, from Paris, from Cambridge, really trying to clean up the river. They put sensors up and down the river to track contaminants. There's been lots of pressure to try to clean up the city's wastewater treatment plants. So there is lots of progress, but the progress is not done. It's not over. And Six Nations has a huge part to play in bringing awareness, in developing their own technologies and methods to clean out that Grand River, and really being leaders in how to teach us how to treat our environment properly. So that's the project. So if you're interested in how to analyze the contamination on First Nations land, if you're interested in figuring out where that contamination is coming from, and then probably equally as important, developing culturally relevant technologies to try to treat that contamination, it's important to contact Makasa, contact Professor Martin Hill, or contact myself. I think Hannah is going to put up a Facebook link if you want to be involved in the water survey. Please, this is a community effort, and it's a really critical effort, both to bring awareness and to bring knowledge about how best to remediate our environments so that they can be used with care and respect in the ways they were supposed to be.